it is true that the Russians can use any pause in the fighting to rearm, but so can the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have a fairly substantial military industry of their own. This has given enough to the shock to the Europeans that they're waking up, and their defence expenditure is expected to go through the roof. So I'm not clear that this is necessarily a terrible thing for Ukraine at all. I think this is probably rather wise of them, given the circumstances. They've gotten some reasonable concessions, and they haven't given away particularly much that we know of in return.
Let's get into the detail of what we learned yesterday. After 9 hours of talks in Jeddah, Ukraine's accepted a US plan for an immediate 30-day ceasefire with Russia. The US said it would immediately resume intelligence sharing and security assistance to Ukraine. This is clearly a significant change, and what an improvement in relations between the US and Ukraine after that shouting match between President Zelensky and President Trump less than a fortnight ago. Well, our Prime Minister Keir Starmer congratulated the two leaders on what he described as a remarkable breakthrough. But now, clearly, the attention turns to Russia. Speaking after the talk, Zelensky's chief of staff called on Russia to back the ceasefire proposal.
Russia needs to say very clearly, they want peace or not. They want to end this war, which they started, or not. And this is today the position of Ukraine was absolutely clear. It's absolutely understandable. And now it's important that the people in the world will understand, because this war, it's created the many crises.
We're going to get more on the Ukrainian perspective in just a moment or two. But first, let's go live to Jeddah, where the talks were taking place. The international correspondent Ryan Thompson is there. Ryan, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
This is a remarkable turnaround in relations.
Yeah, absolutely massive. But I really don't think you can underscore enough that Ukraine just didn't have a choice here. This was a high-stakes make-or-break meeting for them. They really needed the U.S. to be on their side. I think you could see that with the delegation. They were still quite rattled from that messy Oval Office meeting 2 weeks ago. You know, in the lead-up where the journalists are actually allowed into the room to see them meeting for the first 5 minutes and take pictures, you could see the tension in the air. Marco Rubio was smiling, but on the other side of the table, the Ukrainian delegation, they just had this blank expression. So Ukraine really went into this doing everything it could to change the tone, notably apologize, express gratitude, which is what this administration wanted to hear. And I think the U.S. had no choice but to work with them.
And the positive for Ukraine, they've sort of gone back to where they were 11 days ago in terms of America resuming military aid and intelligence sharing. The deal seems to have gone actually further than what we were anticipating. Ukraine's original proposal was talking about sort of naval and air ceasefire. What it looks like was agreed yesterday. This is also involving a halt to combat on the ground.
Yeah, I think we were all surprised by the communique, which was a, quote, readiness to accept and enact this immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which could be extended. That's not what the U.S. said it was looking for going into these talks. They said they wanted to hear about concessions, giving up land, basically, redrawing the map, which, ironically, we heard nothing about. So how they convinced Ukraine to lay down arms, including on the battlefield, we're still trying to suss that out.
I mean, the next steps, though, I mean, this is a very first tentative step. And I think probably in terms of relations, at least an improvement. I mean, what we've been hearing from the White House, but also from Ukrainian officials is now, you know, this ceasefire proposal has to be handed over to President Putin.
Yeah, hopefully something that is easier done than said in terms of getting his sign-off. But, you know, keep in mind, Rosie, we've seen statements from the Kremlin over the past few weeks suggesting that the foreign policy shift of America is, quote, in line with the Kremlin more than ever before. Trump, for example, has spoken to Putin. That's already more communication than his predecessor, President Biden. So the U.S. is now sending this proposal with a high-level representative directly to Russia. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is going to head to Moscow either today or tomorrow. Secretary Rubio was asked about this at the conclusion of talks. He said, we're going to take the offer to them. But I liked his last line. He said, if they say no, then we'll know that it's them who are the impediment to peace here.
Yes, you suggest there's some significant and very turbulent conversations to come. I mean, President Trump says he hopes to meet President Putin. When might that happen?
Here in Saudi Arabia, delegates say that that summit is very much underway and in preparations. The diplomacy has already begun. I think it could easily be something we see in the month of April. Saudi Arabia is enjoying the role that they've had, playing host to, of course, those meetings just a few weeks ago between U.S. representatives and the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. Of course, these Ukraine talks have now just taken place here. I think Saudi Arabia really sees itself as the stage, and they're doing the work to make sure that those summits can go ahead.
Brian, thank you so much. The international correspondent Brian Thompson speaking to us live from Jeddah. Well, air alerts rang out in 12 of Ukraine's regions last night, just minutes after the news of the agreement broke. And it does sort of course, bring home the fact that this is a ceasefire proposal that Ukraine have accepted, but there are several steps ahead. Tom Mutch is a freelance journalist who lives in Ukraine, who's helped us keep across developments over the last few weeks. And Tom's with us now. Tom, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
What did you make of that analysis that actually Ukraine have sort of been strong-armed into this position?
I am not 100% sure that Ukraine is entering this entirely unwillingly. Ukraine is in a much better position than it seemed 10 days ago with the, obviously after that disastrous meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the White House. In fact, what we've got now is, remember, what Ukraine was worried about is the idea of a long-term ceasefire that would then make the US just walk away and leave them with no security guarantees. As it is, they've gotten a switchback on of US military aid. They've got a resumption in US intelligence sharing, both of which were hurting them on the battlefield.
And that was immediate, wasn't it? That's already resumed.
Yes, exactly. It was quick, minimal, with no fuss, which also suggests that the rift between Trump and Zelensky was more about personalities and more about characters than it really was about the substantive difference. And it does seem that their sort of second in commands have managed to iron those differences out rather quickly. But I think it also means that now Ukraine has done its end of the bargain to show, look, we are not in some ways the people holding up the process here. They're like, look, Russia's violated ceasefires before. And I think in a way, they're giving them the opportunity to do so again, to prove that they're not the impediment to a lasting peace, to prove that the Russians are the ones who are, if anyone's going to break a ceasefire, it's going to be the Russians. And yes, it is true that the Russians can use any pause in the fighting to rearm, but so can the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have a fairly substantial military industry of their own. This has given enough shock to the Europeans that they're waking up and their defense expenditure is expected to go through the roof. So I'm not clear that this is necessarily a terrible thing for Ukraine at all. I think this is probably rather wise of them, given the circumstances. They've gotten some reasonable concessions and they haven't given away particularly much that we know of in return. I'd love to know what happened behind the scenes, though, when we get the diplomatic history of what really happened over the last 3 weeks, but with back channels and stuff, it's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, and you talk about European defence chiefs. They're actually meeting today in Paris, including the UK Defence Secretary. I think they will be encouraged by the news yesterday, which does feel like kind of the best way to describe it is a remarkable turnaround from what we've seen in the last fortnight or so. Zelensky's going to be invited back to the White House. Clearly, everyone will be desperate for this improvement in relations to continue.
Yes, that's clear. Look, I think one of the things about Donald Trump is that think about how many people he's fallen out with. Then think about how many of those people, particularly Republican politicians who laid into him many years ago, now then he seems to have made up relations with very quickly. Remember all of the yelling that he was doing with, and I don't want to compare the two men as world leaders, but remember all the yelling he was doing at each other with Kim Jong-un, and then they shook hands in the demilitarized zone in between the Koreas. There's a long, long history of Donald Trump having these huge rows with people and then mending bridges reasonably soon afterwards. So I think that there is a real chance that they can have some kind of a constructive partnership here. Now, I don't know what this necessarily means for the long-term European security implications. I think one of the worries from this breakdown, at least over the last couple of weeks, is that the Europeans are going to think, well, what if this happens again? And what if this happens for a longer period of time? But I think this is a pretty positive short-term development.
It sounds it. Tom, thank you so much, as ever. It's been such a pleasure to have you. Tom Mutch, the freelance journalist who lives in Ukraine, who's sort of kept us across what's been happening over the last few weeks or so. Tom, thank you. It's 5:15.